While most 8-year-olds are learning the alphabet or playing tag at recess, Leah spends her days in silence, fixing broken radios, sketching circuits in a faded notebook, and riding the bus with her mother to the towering tech company where she cleans offices. No one knows Leah exists. No one sees her. No one. But one day, when a cyber attack brings the entire company to its knees, it's Leah, not the engineers, not the executives, who understands what's happening. When she quietly asks to try, something extraordinary begins. How can a child the world forgot become the one to save it? What happens when a powerful CEO finally meets someone he can't ignore? Stay with us to discover how brilliance can bloom in silence and how being seen can change everything. Leah walked exactly 6 steps behind her mother, not because she was told to, but because she liked watching the way her mother moved through spaces that didn't belong to her. Her mother never rushed, never looked up, never acted like she was trying to belong in the marble and glass corridors of Virion Technologies. She was invisible on purpose. Leah had learned early that being invisible could be a kind of power, especially in places where you weren't supposed to be. She clutched her frayed backpack tightly, careful not to let the broken zipper snag on her hoodie. Inside were her most prized things, her notebook, a broken digital watch, and a cracked USB drive that no longer worked but that she couldn't let go of. When they entered through the employee side entrance, the security guard didn't even glance at Leah. He never did. Her mother muttered, 39, and they both knew what that meant, same floor, same shift. Leah didn't ask questions. She peeled off and sat on the soft bench in the lobby corner, just as she did every day, legs swinging slightly. Then she pulled out her notebook, flipped past pages filled with doodles of circuit paths and fake command lines, and started sketching again. It was her favorite part of the day, when she could pretend she belonged here, too. By the time her mother disappeared behind the service elevators, Leah was already deep into designing a pretend motherboard she imagined could talk to phones through air. Her pencil scratched quickly, following the logic in her head. She barely noticed the steady rhythm of people walking past, the sharp heels, the impatient murmurs of morning meetings, the click of tablet cases opening and snapping shut. All of it faded into the background. What mattered was the idea forming on the page, a device that didn't need wires, one that understood broken signals. She'd seen something like it once on a YouTube channel she wasn't supposed to be on. Though she barely remembered the video, the concept had clung to her. She began drawing not just the board but its imagined code, symbols only she understood, letters and numbers arranged like a secret alphabet. It was when she was mid-sentence in her imagined function name that the first flicker happened. The overhead lights dimmed. She paused, blinking. Then the screens in the room blinked to black all at once, like eyes closing. Leah sat very still. Around her, murmurs turned to voices, voices to rising tension. Phones came out. People tapped. Some shouted. Then someone cursed. She heard one word, breach. The change in tone was immediate. A man near the reception desk slammed his tablet on the counter. "What do you mean we're locked out?" he barked into his earpiece. Another woman sprinted across the lobby, murmuring something about remote command failsafe. Leah had no idea what her job title was, but her suit had buttons, and her voice had the kind of certainty that made others follow. The building, so polished and perfect minutes ago, had been jolted into a slow unraveling. Leah didn't move. She knew not to. The moment you got noticed, people remembered to tell you to leave. So she watched, silent and wide-eyed, absorbing everything. A cluster of men near the elevators were already blaming each other. One mentioned a kernel override. Another whispered, malware vector. Leah recognized that one, malware. She'd read about it. She'd watched people simulate attacks on demo systems. She didn't fully understand the infrastructure, but the way they were reacting, their panic, the overlapping terminology, told her more than their words did. She wasn't guessing. She was reading them. When someone muttered, "This can't be happening today," Not today. She looked up at the big screen above reception. It was still black. Her eyes narrowed. What's today? A young man with spiky hair and a blazer 2 sizes too big was pacing near the window, muttering into his phone, "He's going to kill us. This is the biggest client presentation of the year. We're dead." Leah scribbled the words, "client presentation," next to her diagram. She didn't know why, but it felt like a key. They were too panicked for this to be just a regular crash. Something had been targeted. She listened closer. The receptionist said someone had tried to reboot the local servers. No change. Another man said they tried pinging external DNS. Still locked. Leah tapped her pencil against the edge of her notebook. None of these people sounded like they actually knew where the failure started. They were all reacting, trying the usual doors and finding them locked. She didn't speak, but she turned to a fresh page and began jotting what she would have done. Start by isolating the breach point. Was it internal or external? Use a diagnostic shell. Look for anomalies in traffic signatures. She wasn't sure if she could fix it, but she was sure of something else: they couldn't. That thought hit her harder than expected. All these adults with their suits and badges had no idea what to do. For the first time in her life, Leah felt something shift inside her, not like the curiosity she always had, but heavier, a mix of dread and clarity, like holding a match too close to paper and realizing the fire is about to spread. It wasn't that she thought she could solve it all, but something in the way they were flailing reminded her of the time her cousin had tried to plug an old hard drive into the TV and nearly wiped out all its settings. Leah had sat beside him and quietly rebooted the OS with a makeshift patch from her USB. She had figured that out in minutes, even though no one had taught her. Now, here she was again, in a room full of people who had all the tools, all the money, all the authority, and no map, no idea where to start. She looked down at her notes. The symbols were starting to organize themselves into something real, almost like her mind was constructing a blueprint in reverse, decoding a mess without needing to see the code. She tightened her grip on the pencil. She hadn't meant to be here today, but now it felt like she was meant to be here now. Somewhere in the upper floors, alarms were softly going off, alerts, not emergencies. But Leah barely noticed. Her focus tunneled. She started writing faster, connecting what she'd heard to what she knew: kernel-level breach, system-wide access denial, failure to restore from backup. It sounded like someone had intentionally locked down the system from the inside, not destroyed it, not wiped it, but frozen it, which meant the structure was still there. Somewhere beneath all their panic, the skeleton of the system was still waiting to be accessed, if you knew where to look. Leah breathed out slowly. She wasn't scared. She felt instead like she had when she first pried open an old desktop tower her neighbor had thrown away. Everyone said it was junk, but inside, it still worked. She just needed a screwdriver, a little time, and no one watching over her shoulder. Now, watching the chaos unfold in front of her, she felt something unmistakable: I know what this is. Leah had never seen so many important people in one place, all looking so utterly lost. They stood inside a glass-walled room near the central stairwell, a mix of expensive suits and wrinkled hoodies, some with phones glued to their ears, others staring blankly at screens filled with blinking red warnings. One screen flashed something that looked like a global map, but the only color on it was crimson, spreading like ink through every node. Leah inched closer, her worn sneakers silent against the tile, careful not to draw attention. She hugged her notebook to her chest, her eyes darting between the faces of the men and women who were supposed to know everything. Some were shouting, others whispering in hushed, frantic tones. A heavy-set man near the front banged his fist on the table. "This can't be internal," he barked. "We triple firewalled this entry point after Zurich." A woman next to him replied, "Then it's a ghost protocol. It's mimicking normal user behavior, too clean to be brute force." Leah didn't know every term they used, but she understood what was missing. They weren't asking the right questions, not even close. The air wasn't just tense, it was frantic. Leah watched as someone attempted a manual override on the system, fingers flying across a keyboard, only to be met with a wall of rejection codes. Blocked again, he muttered. Level 4 encryption loop. Who the hell builds this stuff? Another voice snapped back, someone who really wants us offline. One man, a little older than the rest and clearly used to being the loudest in the room, turned toward the open door and called to someone unseen, "Can we reach Marcus? We need top-level override clearance." A nervous assistant stammered, "He's in a boardroom upstairs on the call." Or at least he was. Leah understood what they weren't saying. Whatever had happened, it was happening fast, and no one had control. For a moment, she forgot to stay invisible. She took a half-step forward and, as if her thoughts escaped her mouth before she could stop them, said quietly, "Have you checked the socket overflow loop?" The words landed like a pebble in water. There was a pause, heads turned. One man snorted, "What did she say?" Another rolled his eyes, "Jesus, who let someone's kid in here?" But one woman blinked slowly. She didn't laugh. She didn't dismiss. She just looked at Leah, thoughtful and still. Leah felt the heat rise to her cheeks and instantly regretted speaking. She'd broken her rule, don't get seen, don't get heard. She took a step back, already imagining her mother's panicked face if someone found out Leah had wandered this far. Her hand gripped the notebook tighter, ready to turn and vanish like smoke. But before she could disappear, she noticed someone watching her, not with annoyance, but with quiet curiosity. He was younger than the others, probably just a few years older than a high school senior, standing a bit behind the main cluster. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't typing. He was watching. Elias, that was the name on his badge. Leah glanced at him, then looked away, but not before she saw his head tilt slightly, like he was turning over her words in his mind. Elias wasn't like the others. His eyes didn't judge. They tried to understand. Leah felt a strange mix of fear and hope twist in her stomach. She knew what she said wasn't random. It wasn't a guess. She'd seen that exact kind of loop problem in a simulation once, on a bootleg program she'd hacked into late one night, sitting cross-legged on her neighbor's tile floor with a broken keyboard balanced on her knees. It wasn't theory to her. It was memory. The older man who had laughed now paced in a slow circle, muttering about wasted time. "We're throwing darts in the dark," someone said. "None of the backdoor patches are working. We don't even know what we're up against," someone else added. "And we can't reach Marcus. He's going to find out when the metrics hit the investor screens. He's going to explode." All of it should have scared Leah, but strangely, it didn't. What scared her more was how far off their guesses were, how lost they were inside a system that was clearly showing signs of being tampered with from a structural level. They were looking for brute force entry points, but this was different. This wasn't loud. This was elegant. Something had nested inside their protocols, something that knew how to avoid detection, something written by someone who understood the system better than they did. Leah knew that kind of logic. She felt it. The worst part? She wasn't even sure she could explain how she knew. That was the curse of learning alone, you had no words for what you learned by instinct. Her mouth opened again, but this time, no sound came out. In the glass room, people began to split into factions, some desperate to do something, others afraid of doing the wrong thing. The woman who had blinked slowly earlier finally said aloud, "We should at least check what she said." Her voice wasn't forceful, but it was firm. Another voice, someone defensive, snapped, "We're really listening to a kid now." That's when Elias finally stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He just said, her question made sense. Heads turned again. It's a logical entry point for a recursive lockout, especially if the attacker wanted to make it look like user error. He looked at Leah, then back at the others. Let's not pretend anyone in this room has a better lead. The room went quiet again. Leah swallowed. She didn't understand office politics, but she understood the look Elias gave her. It wasn't charity. It was belief, not full-blown trust, maybe, but something that might become it. She had cracked the silence. Whether they liked it or not, she was no longer invisible. Leah took another step back, unsure whether she had helped or made things worse. The men in suits were still skeptical. The engineers remained restless. But the conversation had shifted, not dramatically, not obviously, but something had changed. She had injected an idea into the room that didn't exist before. She had made them pause. That was rare. That meant something. As she backed into the hallway, slipping behind a column to watch from a distance, she felt Elias's gaze follow her, not with suspicion, but with interest. He hadn't looked away since she spoke. He stood still as the chaos reassembled around him, watching her retreat. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply noted her, like a puzzle piece that hadn't been on the table a moment ago. Leah sank down to the floor outside the room, opened her notebook again, and scribbled 3 words, socket overflow loop. If they wouldn't check it, she would. She wasn't guessing. She was remembering. They let her in because they had nothing left. It wasn't a real decision, not one made with logic or trust. It was a moment born out of exhaustion, of failure compounded on failure, a collective shrug from people who were supposed to have answers. The IT lead, a tall man with thinning hair and a sarcastic edge, muttered something like, "Sure, why not? Maybe the janitor's kid can do what our whole division couldn't." A few chuckles rippled through the glass room, nervous, bitter laughs that didn't reach the eyes. No one moved to stop her. No one really believed she'd do anything more than sit at the terminal and stare blankly at the mess on the screen. But Elias, the quiet intern with the watchful eyes, had stayed near her. He hadn't said much since defending her in the last meeting, but he stepped forward now and gently pulled out a chair. "Here," he said softly, "you'll need to stand on it a little. The table's too high." Leah nodded once, clutched her notebook to her chest like armor, and stepped up with the small dignity of someone who'd learned not to flinch in front of laughter. No one offered her guidance. No one explained the problem. She didn't ask. She looked at the terminal for a full 10 seconds before even touching the keyboard. Her fingers hovered, not from hesitation, but from calibration, lining up her muscle memory with a layout she already knew by instinct. The screen was a tangle of command prompts, locked admin layers, and firewall refusals. There were diagnostic tools open on the side, most of them frozen mid-query. Leah exhaled through her nose. She recognized enough of the shell interface to know someone had attempted at least 3 different backdoor recoveries. All had failed. That meant the breach wasn't brute force. It was personal, designed to slip inside without being noticed. Her eyes flicked up, not to the code, but to the wall behind the terminal. There was a shelf. On it, a single photo frame, slightly tilted. She adjusted her stance and squinted. A little girl, grinning, no older than 5, sitting on someone's shoulders. The man's face was cropped, but his watch matched the one worn by the furious CEO who had stormed through the lobby an hour ago. The frame's base had a tiny engraving, "Amelia, 4 a.m. welcome to the world." Leah smiled faintly, just once. Then she typed, "For Amelia." The reaction was instant, but not dramatic. The screen didn't explode in light. There was no beeping or countdown, just a soft blink, a small prompt window opening where none had opened before. Elias, peering over her shoulder, leaned in. "Did you just," he started, then stopped. The sarcastic IT lead, who had been scrolling on his phone with a look of detached disdain, glanced over and froze. "Wait, what was that?" Leah didn't answer. She was already 2 layers in, navigating with a familiarity that made it look rehearsed. Her fingers didn't fumble. She typed commands like someone who wasn't learning but recalling. Her notes remained untouched on the desk beside her. She didn't need them. She wasn't checking guesses. She was moving. One of the engineers leaned forward slowly. "That override key," he muttered. "We didn't even try using a personal-based fallback." Another replied, "We don't have personal-based fallbacks in the admin system, do we?" No one had an answer. Leah just kept going. She wasn't showing off. She didn't even seem aware of the room anymore. The way she worked was quiet, deliberate, like she was listening to a rhythm the rest of them couldn't hear. The room's tension shifted, not released, but reoriented. It was no longer the tension of helplessness. Now it was the tension of disbelief. A dozen adults, all trained, all credentialed, stood watching a child type lines of commands and navigate a maze they had built but could no longer enter. For several seconds, no one dared speak. The only sound was the soft tap of Leah's fingers and the faint whir of the CPU fans behind the terminal. The woman from earlier, one of the few who hadn't dismissed her immediately, stepped closer and murmured, "She found the admin shell." The IT lead, stunned, blinked rapidly. "That shouldn't even be visible without authentication." Elias nodded once, still watching. "Because she authenticated," he said. "Manually, with the CEO's personal cipher." The silence deepened. No one wanted to say what they were all thinking, that they'd overlooked the most obvious point of failure, the one hiding in plain sight. Not a system flaw, but human vulnerability. A father who had named his daughter at 4 a.m. had let that moment follow him into everything, even his passwords. Leah had known where to look, not because she was lucky, but because she understood people. She'd seen enough locked doors to recognize the ones that weren't meant to be locked at all. It was Elias who broke the silence again. He stepped forward, not to explain, not to interfere, but to kneel beside Leah. "You're in the shell," he said gently. "What are you looking for now?" She didn't look at him, but she answered. "The first loop." Her voice was calm, clear. "If I find the entry pattern, I can reverse the lockout." Her hands didn't slow. She navigated logs, error reports, corrupted data entries. Some were disguised to look benign. She didn't fall for it. Her fingers danced between the traps like she'd been born doing it. No one had taught her this. No one had given her a course or a certificate. Her education had come from scraped tutorials, broken devices, and nights alone with borrowed machines. Yet here she was, doing what none of them could. The room now stood behind her, silent, humbled, watching a child peel back the layers of failure they had built around themselves. A joke, they'd thought, a spark of absurdity. But now that spark had ignited something far more terrifying. The truth that they had missed what mattered most. When Leah bypassed the first layer of encryption, when the lockout screen gave way to a new set of access fields and the static red overlay faded from one of the central displays, no one was laughing anymore. News moved faster than approval. It leapt from one department to another, not as an official memo or chain of command, but as whispers exchanged over trembling coffee cups and anxious glances between monitors. "The janitor's daughter is doing something to the system." It sounded like a joke, the kind that shouldn't have reached the ears of upper management, but it did. Marcus Vale, CEO of Virion Technologies, was pacing silently inside a smaller boardroom 2 floors up, staring at his dim tablet screen as the metrics flatlined. Around him, executives tried to save a collapsing investor call with polite lies and frozen smiles, but Marcus wasn't listening. He tapped his tablet with increasing frustration, then slammed it on the table and looked to his assistant. "Why is the system still down?" he demanded. The assistant, barely older than Elias, stammered something about an encryption layer and a breach protocol, then hesitated. "Sir, there's, someone working on it." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "Who?" The assistant swallowed. "A girl from the lobby. Maintenance staff's daughter, I think." Marcus blinked as if he'd misheard. He didn't speak. He simply turned, left the room, and walked straight for the incident floor, suspicion already brewing in his chest like poison. Leah had no idea who Marcus Vale was or that he was now watching her from behind the glass like a hawk studying a puzzle he didn't like. Her entire focus was on the terminal, the lines of corrupted logs unraveling like threads she'd been pulling on since she was 5. Her lips were pressed together in a hard line, her brows pinched, her body slightly tilted forward in a stance she had unconsciously trained from hundreds of nights leaning over scavenged hardware. Her hands didn't shake, not because she wasn't nervous, she was, but because she didn't have time to entertain fear. Every second she hesitated was another second the system slipped further away from recovery. She was already 3 shell layers in, navigating blind using pattern recognition rather than access tools, because half the diagnostic functions had been disabled by the breach itself. Her notebook sat beside her, pages fluttering from the draft of nearby movement, but she hadn't touched it in minutes. Leah didn't need to reference anything anymore. She had internalized the logic, not just of the system, but of the attacker's thought process. That was what no one else saw. This wasn't just a code battle. It was language, and she understood it like a second skin. Behind the glass wall, Marcus folded his arms, disbelief hardening into something colder. He looked at the girl, a child, really, her sleeves pushed up, her hoodie far too large for her frame, her fingers dancing over a keyboard built for professionals, not playgrounds. He turned to one of the engineers standing nearby. "Get security," he said flatly. "Now." The engineer flinched. "Sir, she's a child." Marcus snapped, "And this is a multi-million-dollar infrastructure. I won't have liability on top of sabotage." His voice was quiet but ironclad. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. People obeyed Marcus Vale the way machines obeyed scripts, automatically, without needing to understand the code behind the order. 2 men from building security were dispatched within seconds, one of them already muttering something into his earpiece. Inside the room, the IT lead noticed them first and stiffened. He said nothing, but his expression shifted from confusion to discomfort. Then Elias turned and saw them too. His eyes widened slightly. He moved without thinking, stepping in front of Leah, planting himself between her and the incoming officers like a line of untested firewall code, fragile, maybe, but absolutely resolute. "She's the only one making progress," Elias said, his voice louder than intended. The words hung in the air like sparks over gasoline. One of the guards paused, caught off guard by the certainty in the boy's voice. The second one looked to Marcus, waiting for confirmation, but Marcus didn't respond immediately. He was watching Elias now, studying not just his words, but the way his shoulders were squared, how his legs shook just slightly even though he stood still. The boy was scared, but he wasn't backing down. "You're telling me," Marcus said slowly, "that you've turned our critical recovery efforts over to a child with no clearance, no training, and no permission." Elias didn't flinch. "I'm telling you," he said, "she's inside the system, deeper than we ever got, and she hasn't triggered a single failsafe." Marcus's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered, doubt or curiosity, it was impossible to tell. The other engineers began murmuring behind them, "She opened logs we couldn't reach. She isolated anomalies in the second cluster. She might actually be doing it." But Leah still hadn't looked up. She didn't even register the shift in atmosphere. She hadn't seen Elias move or the guards hesitate. She was deep inside the breach's architecture now, dissecting command injections and reverse engineering data packets designed to mislead. It wasn't just talent. It was clarity, the kind that came from hours of tinkering with chaos until patterns emerged like stars in smog. Leah recognized that the code wasn't random. It was personal. A human wrote this. Someone brilliant and angry. Someone who had woven their grudge into every corner of the system like a story waiting to be decoded. She followed their trail like breadcrumbs, not afraid, not hurried. Her expression hadn't changed since she sat down, but her pulse pounded in her ears. This was the kind of challenge she had always dreamed of, the one that wasn't just about solving, but understanding. Somewhere in the room, someone whispered, "She's breaking through another layer." A few others stepped closer. Even the IT lead, who had scoffed before, was now leaning over with guarded awe. But Leah didn't hear them. Her mind was wrapped in binary, her heart synced with logic. She was far beyond distraction, far beyond doubt. As she typed, completely unaware of the eyes on her, Leah remained the only person in the building who wasn't waiting for permission, because she didn't need it. She was already inside the machine. Leah's fingers moved with the rhythm of instinct now, barely aware of the keyboard beneath them. She had gone 3 layers deeper into the system's architecture, and the corruption she saw wasn't random. It was almost elegant. This wasn't the reckless chaos of a typical breach. This was artful, methodical, deliberate. Whoever had written this wanted to be found, but only by someone who knew how to read between the lines. Leah leaned in, eyes narrowing as the code began to feel less like a barrier and more like a language, dense, dangerous, but strangely beautiful. There were loops with decoy payloads, recursive traps pretending to be critical files, and decision trees designed to mimic system logic so precisely that even experienced engineers would walk into digital dead ends. But Leah didn't take the expected routes. She moved sideways, diagonally through the structure, like navigating a maze she somehow already knew. Her breaths came slower. She wasn't just solving a problem anymore. She was deciphering a story. One line of malformed syntax caught her eye. Not because it was wrong, but because it was familiar. Her heart stuttered once, confused, then curious, and then it hit her. She had seen this before. The script fragment wasn't copied exactly. It had evolved, but the bones were unmistakable. Leah remembered the night she first encountered something like it. She'd been at the borrowed internet cafe across from her cousin's apartment. Her mother thought she was sleeping in the back room. Instead, she had taken the cracked laptop with the flickering screen and logged into a forgotten forum filled with broken links, cryptic usernames, and code dumps that weren't meant for children. Most of it was garbage. But one thread had been different, a discussion titled, "Digital Phantoms, Symmetric Disruption Methods." No replies, just a file dump and a line of commentary. It's not about breaking in. It's about becoming the door. Leah had been too young to understand all of it, but something about the script had stayed with her. She copied it by hand into a lined notebook, then spent weeks recreating it on her cousin's old tower PC, tweaking, testing, pulling it apart like a puzzle. The version she was seeing now wasn't hers, but it had to be a descendant of that same logic tree. There were matching fragments, identical fault triggers, even the same obscure variable names. This wasn't coincidence. This was a signature. Her fingers froze over the keys, the spell of pure logic breaking under the weight of recognition. She wasn't staring at a stranger's attack anymore. She was staring at someone who had walked the same crooked path as she had, alone, outside the system, self-taught, and unseen. This wasn't just malicious code. It was a fingerprint, a voice calling out across the dark, disguised as sabotage. A hacker who had once studied the same forbidden lines, likely in the same hushed desperation, likely with no mentor, no classroom, no structure. Just fire and frustration and a mind that moved too fast for the world around it. Leah felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. For the first time, she wasn't sure whether she should feel awe or fear. Because if someone like her had gone down this path and chosen destruction over discovery, then what did that say about the fine line she'd been walking all her life? She had always believed that her strange gift, her ability to see systems as stories, made her different in a good way. But what if it was also what made her dangerous? She sat back slightly, her hands trembling now, her mind racing through a web of emotions she didn't know how to name. There was no one here to ask, no teacher to explain what it meant when your enemy felt like your reflection. Was this person trying to destroy Virion out of vengeance? Was it personal, or was it just another experiment, someone pushing boundaries just to see where they broke? Leah's stomach twisted. The code wasn't angry. It wasn't frantic. It was precise, cold, patient, and that scared her more than any chaotic attack could have. Because that meant whoever wrote it had been in control, not lashing out, but choosing. She thought of the little girl in the photo frame, Amelia, and wondered what would have happened if the system hadn't been stopped. Would the attack have erased files, stolen client data, left the company exposed to ruin? Or worse, would it have looked like an accident? Leah's mind spun for the first time in the whole ordeal. She hesitated. She thought of pulling her hands away and letting someone else take over, letting the adults figure it out. But the adults hadn't recognized the trail. Only she had. Elias noticed the shift. He had been quiet for several minutes, unwilling to distract her. But now he leaned closer. "Leah," he said gently. She didn't look up. "What is it?" he asked. "Did you find something?" Her voice was small but steady. "Yeah," she said. I think I know who built this." Elias blinked. "You mean, like a group?" "No," she whispered. "I mean someone like me." He didn't answer right away. He understood enough not to fill the silence with reassurances. Leah kept typing, slower now, tracing the logic trail further down into the roots of the corrupted system. But something had changed in her posture, shoulders tight, movements cautious, not because she was unsure of the code, she understood it better than anyone in the room, but because she now understood what it meant. This wasn't just a puzzle anymore. It was a conversation, a challenge. Someone had planted this breach, knowing that only a specific kind of mind would be able to follow it to the core. Someone like her. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. Because if they were out there, waiting, watching, what would they do when they realized someone had followed? Still, Leah didn't stop. She kept going, even as her hands trembled slightly. She kept digging deeper, each line of code a step closer to a confrontation she hadn't expected. She wasn't just fixing a system. She was following a trail. At the end of that trail wasn't just a bug or a virus. It was a mind like hers, a mirror, twisted. A person who had already walked the road she was now on, someone who once saw the world in numbers and logic and shadows and chose to turn that vision into destruction. Leah didn't know who they were. She didn't know why they had done it. But she knew this: if someone like that existed, she had to see it through, not for Virion, not for Marcus, not even for her mother, but for herself. To prove that there was another path, another ending, a different kind of legacy. Because this ghost in the system had spoken her language, and she was ready to answer. When the system's heartbeat flickered back to life, just a faint line of green across one of the big screens, everyone in the room gasped or murmured, some even exhaling curses of disbelief. But Marcus Vale didn't move. He didn't clap. He didn't smile. He stood at the back of the room, arms folded, watching the tiny girl at the terminal like she'd grown out of the circuitry itself. His executives whispered behind him. Engineers exchanged stunned looks, and one manager even started pacing like a man waking from a nightmare. But Marcus's eyes never left her. Her name was Leah, no last name, not yet. He only knew what his assistant had told him, the daughter of a cleaning woman, no records, no digital trail outside basic building logs. But now she sat in front of a machine no one else could fix. With hands that barely stretched across the keyboard, she had answered something the entire infrastructure team had failed to crack, not brute force, not luck. She had understood it. She had walked straight into the code and walked back out. Marcus, the man who built this empire on data, efficiency, and risk assessment, had no idea what to make of her. He didn't say a word as she finished typing and stepped back, clutching her worn notebook to her chest like a shield. She didn't look up at anyone, not even when Elias placed a quiet, shaking hand on her shoulder. Someone offered her a water bottle. Another muttered something about needing to inform the board, but Marcus said nothing. He simply turned and left the room without a sound, his mind louder than any explosion. He walked back to his office like a man retracing old steps, his shoes too heavy, his hands clenched tighter than he realized. Once inside, he closed the door, dismissed his assistant with a single look, and opened the security archive feed. The footage was already bookmarked, Leah at the terminal, the exact window of time from when she sat down until the moment the system came back online. He scrubbed the video slowly, watching in silence. The screen flickered through frames, her eyes scanning, her lips pressed tight, her fingers moving, not like a child playing pretend, but like a seasoned technician, confident, decisive, certain. He paused, zoomed in. Her posture, her stillness, that was what struck him most. Not what she was doing, but how she held herself while doing it. There was a memory Marcus hadn't touched in decades. He tried to ignore it, as he always had, but it rose anyway, a dirt path outside the old orphanage in Aveline, a girl, maybe 8 or 9, sitting on a step with a busted radio in her lap, twisting wires with fingers blackened by grease. She never spoke, but she always waited there, every day after classes, every day he came back from errands. She had no family, no chance. She once told him quietly that if she could fix the radio, maybe she could hear voices from a better place. One afternoon, the radio sparked in her hands. She didn't even flinch, just laughed. Marcus had stood behind her, frozen. Then one day, she was gone, no note, no explanation. He never asked what happened. He didn't want to know. He buried it, like he buried most things. He told himself that forgetting was strength, that survival meant cutting ties with what couldn't come with him. But watching Leah now, still framed in the freeze frame of the video, something inside him cracked open. The set of her shoulders, the way she didn't flinch under pressure, it wasn't just talent. It was familiarity. Marcus leaned back in his chair, hands steepled in front of his face, the footage paused but burning into his vision. He wasn't used to being shaken. He had negotiated billion-dollar contracts, faced down boardroom revolts, and recovered from PR disasters that would have crippled lesser men. But none of it had prepared him for the sight of this child. So calm inside the chaos, doing what grown men couldn't, and not for recognition, not for money, just because she could. Now the question wasn't just about what she had done. It was about what it meant. How had he become the kind of man who almost called security on a child whose brilliance outshone his entire team? How had he learned to measure people by their job titles, their lanyards, their LinkedIn profiles, and forgotten that genius often grows in silence, in places where no one's watching? He felt sick, not with guilt, at least not entirely, but with a dawning realization. Somewhere along the way, he had amputated the part of himself that once believed in impossible things, and she had just brought it back, not with words, but with keystrokes. He scrubbed through the footage again, slower this time, watching her movements like a code he needed to understand. He paused at one frame. Her hand resting lightly on the side of the terminal, fingers curled like she was listening through the metal. He thought of that girl at the orphanage again, the one who had vanished before anyone thought to ask where she'd gone. Was Leah going to disappear too, once this moment passed? Would anyone fight to keep her seen? His chest tightened. He knew what the world would do if left alone. It would bury her gift in silence, in poverty, in bureaucracy. They would thank her, maybe even celebrate her for a day. Then they'd forget, unless he didn't let them, unless he stepped forward, not as a CEO, but as a man who once watched someone vanish because no one cared enough to hold on. Leah had cracked his system. But more than that, she had cracked him. Now, sitting in the comfort of his corner office, surrounded by things he once thought mattered, Marcus Vail was left with only one question: what was he supposed to do with this child who had just torn his world open? Still, he stared at the footage, at her face, her hands, her posture, unreadable and so unmistakably familiar. They called her back the next morning, not with ceremony, not with a car or an official letter, but with a single quiet request passed to her mother through an evening supervisor. Leah didn't ask questions. She just nodded and prepared the only way she knew how, by making sure her notebook was in her backpack and that her shoes, worn and thin, still held together. She wore the same hoodie, the one that always slipped past her wrists and made her look smaller than she already was. Her mother didn't walk her all the way in this time, just stood at the entrance, eyes nervous, lips tight, as Leah stepped alone through glass doors and was quietly ushered by a polite assistant to a room with a long table and a single blue chair waiting near the end. No one greeted her with fanfare. No one offered her orange juice or smiled too hard. The tone had changed. They weren't treating her like a child anymore. They were treating her like something else, something they didn't quite understand. She sat down in the blue chair and waited. The room smelled like lemon polish and disinfectant, but she didn't care about that. She was used to that smell, it was the same one on her mother's clothes every day. One by one, they came in, not the whole team from yesterday, just a few key people. Elias was there, notebook in hand, offering her a small, encouraging smile that made her shoulders relax slightly. An older woman with cropped hair and square glasses asked the first question without preamble. "How did you do it?" she said, her voice steady but urgent. Leah blinked. "Which part?" A few people chuckled softly, not mocking her this time, more like surprised admiration. "The override," someone else clarified, "the layered breech tracking, the subshell nesting, all of it." Leah's fingers curled around her pencil. She could feel the old nervousness rising. The kind that told her adults didn't really want her answers, just confirmation of what they already believed. But this time, no one interrupted. No one dismissed her. They were waiting, listening. She looked around the room and then said, as honestly as she could, "I don't know how to explain it with words." A silence followed, not awkward, not disappointed, just open. Leah reached slowly into her backpack, pulled out her notebook, and flipped to a blank page. "But I can show you." Her pencil scratched softly against the paper as the room watched. She didn't look up as she began to draw, not code, not exactly, not diagrams either. What she put on the page was somewhere in between, circuits that turned into tree branches, loops that curved into river paths, color patterns that flowed like weather maps. She shaded with quick precision, connecting components to symbols only she fully understood. She didn't label anything, didn't pause to explain. She just built it the same way she built mental frameworks in her head when tackling code. After several minutes, she turned the page around and slid it forward on the table. No one moved for a moment. Then Marcus, seated across from her with his arms folded and a thoughtful crease between his brows, reached out and pulled it toward him. He didn't ask what it meant. He studied it in silence, turning the page sideways, his eyes scanning the image, not like an engineer, but like a man looking for something beyond the surface. Leah watched him carefully, not because she was hoping for praise, she didn't expect that, but because this moment wasn't about systems anymore. It was about being seen. He kept turning the page in his hands slowly, as if the right angle would unlock something. Then, suddenly, he stopped. His fingers froze on the edge. Leah saw his shoulders change, barely a shift, but noticeable. He saw it, not the drawing exactly, but what the drawing was. A map, not to the breach, not to the solution, but to her, a way in to understand how she thought, how she moved through problems, how she made sense of things too big for conventional steps. She hadn't given them lines of code or flowcharts or bullet-pointed logic. She'd given them her mind in the only language it spoke freely, and Marcus saw it. The others leaned in now, slowly realizing something important was happening, though they didn't quite know what it was. But Leah could tell. Marcus wasn't just analyzing anymore. He was remembering something, something she couldn't name, but could feel in the way he looked at her now, not like an anomaly, not like a miracle, but like a person, like someone who'd once felt this kind of thinking from the inside. Leah shifted slightly in the chair, unsure what to say. She hadn't planned this. She didn't expect to be sitting in a room full of adults who weren't arguing, weren't condescending, but were just quiet, because for once, she had filled the silence with something they couldn't deny. She reached for her notebook but paused when Marcus finally looked up. His face had softened, not in pity, but in understanding. He didn't say thank you. He didn't nod in approval. He just tapped the page once and asked, "This loop here, what do you call it?" She blinked. "It doesn't really have a name. It's just how I keep the structure from collapsing when the problem folds on itself." He nodded slowly. "That's exactly what happened yesterday, isn't it?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." He slid the paper back toward her. "Keep this. Don't change it." Leah tucked it back into her notebook like it was nothing, but her heart was pounding. For the first time, she felt like she hadn't just solved something. She'd spoken something. And he'd listened. When she handed him the drawing, he turned it sideways and saw exactly what it was, a way in, not to the system, but to her. Marcus knew it broke every protocol. He knew it the moment he told his driver to take a left turn into the hills and not toward the office. He said no to the black SUV, no to the security escort, and no to the nervous assistant who tried to hand him a folder of talking points. What he wanted now wasn't in a document. It was in a little girl's home, a place no one in his boardroom would have dared to enter. When he stepped out of the cab at the base of the narrow alley, he felt the shift in atmosphere, not because of the surroundings, but because this was the first time in years he was walking somewhere without being expected. He had to ask twice for the right door, and when it finally creaked open, Leah's mother froze at the sight of him, eyes wide, broom in hand. "You're Mr. Vale?" she asked, half whisper, half fear. Her instinct wasn't pride, it was panic. Did she do something wrong? She didn't mean to. She did everything right, Marcus interrupted. His voice was calm but firm. "I just came to see her world. I promise it's nothing bad." But Leah's mother didn't relax. She nodded slowly and stepped aside, still watching him as though waiting for the twist in the story. Leah sat cross-legged on the floor, a plastic tray of wires and resistors spread out in front of her, as if nothing about the moment required adjusting. She didn't run to greet him. She didn't seem surprised. She simply looked up, held out an old cracked radio, and asked, "Can you fix this one?" No greeting, no nerves, just a challenge, plain and honest. Marcus took the radio from her carefully, weighing its age, its damage, its silence. "I used to," he said, "a long time ago." "Then try," she replied, handing him a screwdriver like she was passing a baton. He crouched down, knees aching more than he cared to admit, and started prying the back open, his fingers slow from years of corporate detachment. Leah watched without commentary, just quiet expectation. Her mother hovered nearby, unsure whether to intervene, until a small boy came barreling out of the back room with a fork in one hand and an empty plate in the other. "Is there more?" he shouted. "Only if someone flips the next batch," Leah called back. "Your turn, Mario." The boy groaned but ran to the stove anyway. Marcus blinked. "Is he your brother?" "Cousin," she said. "He lives here now. Everyone kind of does." That explained the mattress against the wall, the dishes in a bucket, the 3 toothbrushes in a single cup by the door. While Mario burned the edges of the pancakes and Leah's mother attempted to explain that she used only the stove's middle burner because the others sparked too much, Marcus sat in a corner with the broken radio in his lap, feeling strangely out of place and yet more grounded than he had in months. He watched as Leah knelt beside Mario and pointed to a capacitor on a small breadboard. "If it's too weak," she explained, "the charge bleeds out before it can flip the signal. You need to match the resistance." "That's not fair," Mario complained. "I don't even know what resistance is." "Then learn," she said, unbothered. "That's how I did it." Marcus didn't interrupt. He just watched. No toys, no screens, no distractions. The living room was a tangle of wires, notebooks filled with sketches, old parts pulled from radios, fans, broken DVD players. Everything was repurposed. Everything was learned the hard way. He realized that what he'd seen in her at the terminal wasn't trained precision. It was survival, not the panicked kind, but the determined kind, the kind that builds itself from scraps and still dares to function. He finally spoke after the third failed attempt at rewiring the transistor. "Where did you learn how to do all this?" he asked, holding up a barely salvageable switchboard she'd fused together. "Nowhere," Leah replied. "It just started making sense one day. Like math, but with sparks." "When?" She turned to Mario and added, "He didn't even know what a diode was 2 weeks ago. Now he can test polarity without burning his fingers." "That was one time," Mario yelled from the kitchen. "One really big spark," Leah muttered. Marcus laughed, actually laughed, for the first time since this entire ordeal began. It caught him off guard. "You didn't wait for someone to teach you," he said, more to himself than to her. "You just kept going." Leah shrugged. "I had to." There was no bitterness in her tone, just reality. She didn't say it like a complaint. She didn't even seem aware that there was anything unusual about it. That was what struck him most. She didn't act like someone who'd been wronged. She acted like someone who had accepted the terms of the world and quietly rewritten the rules in her favor. As they sat down with plates of lopsided pancakes, Marcus looked around again at the cracked tiles, the hanging wires, the fan that buzzed but didn't turn. Still, it wasn't the poverty that struck him. It was the focus. Every surface had a function. Every object had potential. She had built a lab from a junkyard, a school from silence, and, most unbelievably, she'd done it without falling into cynicism. No anger, no hunger for revenge or attention, just curiosity, a hunger for knowledge. Leah passed him a small page from her notebook, another drawing. This one had pancakes in the margins, but the center was a diagram of a circuit loop designed to store intermittent charges. "I figured out how to store power without a battery," she said. "For emergencies." Marcus didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to respond to a child who had found electricity in broken things and turned it into her own language. He only knew what he felt, a sharp sense of guilt, a quieter sense of awe, and the growing realization that the system hadn't discovered her. She'd simply become too brilliant for it to keep ignoring. Somehow, she had done it without bitterness, like a plant through concrete. Marcus left Leah's home that evening with something lodged in his chest that didn't go away. It followed him back into his polished office, trailed him through a conference call he couldn't focus on, and sat beside him while his legal team droned on about liability clauses and corporate exposure. He heard none of it. All he could think about was the little girl who handed him a circuit loop drawn in the margins of a pancake recipe. The next morning, before his staff even clocked in, he rewrote Virion's internship policy from the ground up, age restrictions gone, minimum GPA requirements modified, background checks and digital portfolios optional. He didn't wait for approvals. He didn't need to. He was the final signature. Then he contacted legal again, this time to establish a scholarship fund under the company's name, not for prodigies from elite schools, but for minds like Leah's, raw, unseen, and brilliant in the places no one was looking. Finally, in a move no one expected, he renamed the rebuilt internal firewall, not after himself, not after some arbitrary product line, but Elia Protect, a silent nod to the girl who walked into a disaster and held it together better than any grown man in the room. But even as he did all of it, something felt unfinished. It wasn't that he doubted the gesture, it was right, it was necessary, but it wasn't personal enough. What Leah had given them, what she had given him, wasn't just a solution. It was a mirror, a challenge, a reminder of something he had long buried. No plaque or scholarship could answer that. It had to come from him directly. So, he called her mother. He didn't use an assistant, didn't filter it through anyone else. He dialed the number himself and asked, awkwardly, nervously, if they would come back to the office, just for a conversation. Nothing formal, just something real. Her mother agreed, though her voice cracked at the end, like she couldn't quite believe it. When they arrived, Marcus didn't take them to a side office or an HR room. He brought them to the boardroom, the same one where decisions were made about millions of dollars, partnerships, and company futures. He wanted Leah to know that this space now included her, that it belonged to her, too. She didn't seem overwhelmed. If anything, she looked bored, but she sat down, notebook in hand, as always. Her mother sat stiffly, clutching her purse like it might vanish. Marcus cleared his throat more times than necessary before finally beginning. "You changed the way we see things here," he said to Leah. "Not just systems, but people, talent, the way we define who's qualified to lead. You walked into chaos and didn't flinch. You didn't wait for permission. You just solved it." Her mother tried to smile, but her eyes filled with tears almost instantly. Marcus looked between them and continued, "I've made some changes. There's a scholarship in your name. I've opened a new mentorship program. Real mentorship, one-on-one. You'll have access to labs, hardware, courses, anything you need to keep growing." Her mother let out a sound between a gasp and a sob, covering her mouth. But Leah didn't cry. She didn't even blink. She just tilted her head slightly, as if filtering his words through some internal logic gate, like a new string of input data she wasn't sure how to process. "You'll be on site," Marcus added, "not just as a visitor, but as part of the team, if you want that." He waited, feeling strangely nervous, like she might say no, like she might shrug and walk away from everything he'd worked so hard to offer. Leah looked at her mother, then back at Marcus. Her voice was quiet, but not shy. "Will I still be allowed to break things?" The question didn't come from fear. It came from a place deeper than that, from understanding. Breaking things was how she learned. It was how she uncovered meaning in machines that others had given up on. It was her way of translating the world. If this offer came with rules that suffocated her method, she wasn't interested. Marcus stared at her for a moment, caught between laughter and disbelief, and then, slowly, genuinely, he smiled, not a polite smile, not a boardroom smile, but a real one, his first in years. "Yes," he said. "That's how we find out what's inside." Her mother let out a breath that broke apart at the end. She cried then, fully, head lowered, tears falling freely into her lap. Leah didn't move to comfort her. She didn't need to. Her hand slid across the table and found her mother's fingers. That was enough. The boardroom fell quiet after that, but it wasn't the kind of silence that needed filling. It was full, solid. Marcus stood slowly, then reached into the folder beside him and slid a small card across the table. It wasn't a contract. It wasn't a schedule. It was a badge, Virion Technologies, Leah, access, full. "You can come in tomorrow," he said. "Or next week, or next month. The lab's yours when you're ready." Leah picked it up without ceremony and turned it over in her hand. "I'll come tomorrow," she said. Marcus nodded once, then turned toward the window, blinking harder than necessary. He wasn't just offering her something. She was offering him something, too, a second chance to build a legacy that didn't just look good on paper, but mattered, something human, something honest. The system had survived the breach, yes, but more importantly, it had gained something it never knew it needed. When he brought Leah and her mother to the boardroom and offered a full-time mentorship, her mother cried. Leah didn't. She just looked at him and said, "Will I still be allowed to break things?" He smiled, the first real smile in years. "Yes. That's how we find out what's inside." Months passed, not with spectacle or ceremony, but with quiet momentum, the kind that builds something lasting. Leah became a fixture at Virion. Not as a novelty or token, but as a presence. Every morning, she rode the bus with her mother, still sitting side by side in the front row, still sharing silence more than words. Her hoodie was the same, though the elbows had been patched now, and her notebook had expanded to a second volume, this one thicker, full of observations, questions, and blueprints of things she hadn't yet told anyone she was building. At Virion, she had her own access badge now, white background, red trim, her name in bold, Leah M., no last name listed, none needed. She had her own corner of the lab, and though it wasn't a private office, no one touched her space. Above the monitor, an enormous screen that made her look even smaller than she was, someone had written Leah's brain in permanent marker. No one admitted who, but she didn't erase it. She liked it there. Engineers brought her snacks. Interns asked for her opinion. Department heads paused outside her station just to see what she was up to, but she didn't perform. She just did what she always had, she worked. What had changed was how they saw her and, perhaps more importantly, how she saw herself, no longer an outsider peering into someone else's world, but now building it from the inside. Her input wasn't second-guessed. When she suggested a redesign to a data funneling protocol, it was implemented. When she found a logic error in a third-party security package, vendors listened. But none of that changed what she did at home. She still scavenged broken toys on the walk from the bus stop, still disassembled discarded radios and ancient calculators, harvesting their insides like a magician pulling stories from forgotten places. Her mother no longer asked her if she was tired. She just placed tea beside her and let her work. Their apartment hadn't expanded, but the energy inside it had. Leah still didn't talk much about Virion at home. Not because she didn't want to, but because there was something so sacred it didn't need to be said. Her mother understood. The way she tucked away Leah's badge into the drawer each night, like it was something holy, told Leah everything she needed to know. At the office, Marcus changed too, though he was far less comfortable with it. His schedule remained full, his calendar color-coded to the minute, but his office had changed in subtle ways. The biggest shift was a small frame on the edge of his desk. Inside it, Leah's drawing, the one she had slid across the table months ago, full of circuits and trees and loops and rivers. He hadn't touched it, hadn't scanned or digitized it, just framed the original page with its pencil smudges and folded edge. Whenever board meetings dragged or negotiations dulled into numbers, his eyes wandered there, and he remembered. He remembered what it had felt like to watch her speak in code without saying a word, to realize she had taught herself not just how to fix the system, but how to see it differently. More than once, he found himself walking down to the lab without a reason, pretending to check on something. Leah would glance up, nod, then go back to work. She never asked why he came, and he never explained, but they both understood. Sometimes, proximity was enough, just knowing someone else knew what you were made of. Yet, for all that growth, for all the press that tried to cover the girl who saved the system, Leah never leaned into it. She never sought interviews or posed for pictures. When a journalist once asked for a quote, she said only, "I liked the problem." That was Leah. She wasn't chasing recognition. She was chasing the next pattern, the next riddle that needed a new kind of thinking. She found plenty of them, on napkins, in software logs, in the inconsistent behavior of small AI tests. She filled notebooks with solutions to questions no one had asked yet. Late one evening, after everyone else had gone home and the lab lights dimmed to their nighttime setting, she stood in Marcus's office with her notebook tucked under her arm. He wasn't there, he'd left earlier for a late dinner with investors. She didn't wait. She placed a note on his desk, just a torn scrap of lined paper, folded twice. On it, in small, careful writing, were 7 words, "Thank you for seeing me." Really seeing me. Marcus found the note hours later. The office was still, the city lit beneath him. He hadn't expected anything when he returned, just a quiet desk, the usual late-night review. But the note was there, right beside the drawing. He sat down slowly, unfolding the paper, reading the words once, then again. His hands stilled, his eyes burned. No one was there to witness it, and he was glad, because for the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't feel like the system he'd built defined him. It was the girl who had cracked its walls and stepped through, who had reminded him what it meant to create something real, not just code, not just machines, but trust, recognition. He sat there for a long time, the note still open in his hand, letting the moment linger, letting the walls fall just a little, and for the first time, he didn't feel alone. Somewhere in that glass tower, a little girl with oil-stained fingers dreamed of stars and knew, deep down, that she belonged. We're a small team behind this channel, and every story you watch here is created with a lot of care, thought, and love, always thinking of you. If this video touched you in any way, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful, heartfelt stories like this one to life. We'd also love to hear from you. What part of Leah's journey stayed with you the most? Leave your thoughts in the comments, we read every single one. If this story moved you, don't forget to give it a like and check out the other videos we've made. Thank you for being with us.